Hello and welcome everybody to the webinar series titled Doing Academia Differently in Conversation with Neuroatypicality. This webinar series follows on from a previous webinar series on post-philosophies and the doing of inquiry. This current webinar is a collaboration between Geert Van Hove from Ghent University, Vivienne Bozalek from the University of the Western Cape, and myself, Candace Kuby from the University of Missouri. Nikki Romano is the support and go-to person to help make this series possible. This is a free webinar series with 10 total sessions, which I think this means it is our second to last, if I'm adding it up correctly. We have one more after today's. We meet monthly on the topic of doing academia differently through conversations with neuroatypicality, and each session involves one or two international guests who have had some experience with neuroatypicality in the context of higher education. The webinar series is made possible by a research collaborative partnership between the University of Missouri System in the USA, the University of Ghent in Belgium, and the University of the Western Cape, or UWC, in Cape Town, South Africa. The partnership between the University of Missouri and UWC started in 1986, and UWC and the University of Ghent have partnered together for more than 20 years. Thus, the Tricontinental Partnership is a trilateral agreement that was set to promote partnership between our three institutions during a time of travel restrictions due to the global pandemic. The funds were provided to support virtual research and teaching collaborations between faculty members at our three institutions. We are so very grateful for our university's longtime collaboration and support of this particular webinar series. These webinars are also available on YouTube. You can find them, you can find out how to access them if you go to the webinar's website, or you can go directly to YouTube. You'll also notice on YouTube, you can select an option for closed captioning to see the written transcript of the webinar. We have updated our website with exact times for each webinar in order to take into account daylight savings time and how that affects different contexts across the world. And I'll also note, we'll share this a little bit more toward the end of our webinar today, but our final webinar is actually going to take place on a Monday and not a Thursday. So be sure to check the webinar and we'll announce that at the end today as well. So I'm excited today to announce two panelists that are with us and to be in conversation. Alise is here, a postdoctoral research fellow at McMaster University, joined by a colleague, Kate Brown. So if Alise and Kate, if you just want to unmute briefly and say a hello to those who are joining us today, and then Nikki will move us into some introductions of the other panelists here, and Geert will do a more extensive introduction when we get to the conversation a little bit later. So Alise, Kate, you want to say a quick hello to those who are here?
Yeah, quick hello to those who are here. It's great to have you here and looking forward to the conversation.
I will just echo Alise, very excited to be here and so lovely to meet all the folks who are on the panel today, as well as the people who are sitting in the audience.
Thanks so much. All right, Nikki, over to you.
Well, I'll just first introduce Nikki.
Oh, sorry about that, Viv, right.
No problem. Nikki is a PhD graduate from the University of the Western Cape and Utrecht University. And she is a lecturer in art history at the Cape Peninsula University of Technology. Nikki's an artist and an art educator, and she's been teaching art at various levels, various sectors across the years. And as Nikki said, she has been providing technical support, and she will be providing this on the webinar platform today. So if anyone needs any assistance, do ask Nikki. And she's also going to be assisting in moderating the question and answer discussions, which will happen at the end of the webinar. And I also want to acknowledge Nikki's artworks, which we're using in the series. Thanks, Nikki.
Thank you, Viv. And now it's my turn to introduce our three co-hosts. Candace Kuby is Professor of Learning, Teaching and Curriculum at the University of Missouri, Associate Provost for Faculty Success and the Director of Qualitative Inquiry. Dr. Kuby's research interests are the coming to be of literacies when young children work with artistic and digital tools, Approaches to and Pedagogies of Qualitative Inquiry when Thinking with Post-Structuralism and Post-Human Philosophies. She's the co-author of several books, including Speculative Pedagogies of Qualitative Inquiry. Her scholarship appears in journals, including Qualitative Inquiry, International Journal of Qualitative Studies in Education, the Journal of Early Childhood Literacy, and the Journal of Literacy Research. Geert Van Hove is a professor in disability studies at Ghent University. His field of research is disability studies and inclusive education. Professor Van Hove was the Disability Studies Professor of the Endowed Chair of Disability Studies at VUMC Amsterdam, the Department of Medical Humanities from 2013 to 2018. In 2017, he was the recipient of the Stephen Taylor Memorial Senior Scholar Award at the Disability Studies in Education Conference in Minneapolis. Vivienne Bozalek is an emerita professor in women and gender studies at the University of the Western Cape and honorary professor in the Center for Higher Education Research, Teaching and Learning at Rhodes University. She holds a PhD from Utrecht University, and her research interests and publications include the political ethics of care and social justice, posthumanism and feminist new materialisms, innovative scholarly practices in higher education, and post-qualitative and participatory research, participatory methodologies. Her most recent co-edited books of 2021 include Posthuman and Political Care Ethics for Reconfiguring Higher Education, Post-Anthropocentric Social Work, Critical Posthuman and New Materialist Perspectives, and Higher Education Ontologies, Living with Ghosts for a Justice to Come. Thank you. Back to you, Candace.
Thanks, Viv and Nikki. So as you might have noticed, we're using the Zoom webinar platform instead of the meeting platform. So right now the hosts have access to video and audio. But as we shift into our question and answer portion of the webinar today, we will give all those who are in attendance the option to come in with video and audio. You don't have to accept that. You can say no if you are not comfortable or willing, or wanting to do that. But just know that will be an option coming up a little bit later after our initial conversation with our guest today. As we mentioned, we are recording the webinar for public viewing later on. It will be on YouTube. And the chat function is open for you to connect with our other attendees during the webinar. I see a good number of you have already posted hellos to each other, so it's great to see that in the chat box. And then also during our question and answer portion today, we have the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you have questions that come to mind as you're hearing Alise and Kate talk today, feel free to go ahead and type those questions in the Q&A box. This will allow myself and Nikki to be able to read those and help moderate the Q&A a little bit later. But again, you'll also have the option of coming in with audio and video if you prefer to voice your question yourself. So the structure of the webinar is as follows. Geert will ask Alise and Kate a number of questions, which we have posed to all of the panelists who have taken part in the series. And then we'll open up a space after that to be in conversation with all those in attendance today in our Q&A portion. We hope to have at least 30 minutes for this dialogue with everyone. Without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Geert to get our conversation started today.
Thank you, Candace. Thank you, colleagues. Welcome to all attendees also from my part of the world. I don't know how your life is, but in Europe, summer is starting, and the good thing is that we get a lot of light, and this can help us to see a bit of light in this dark world we live in. We are so happy to have Alise and Kate with us, and I asked Alise how I should describe the relationship between both colleagues, and I got a really nice little note I will use to introduce both of our colleagues. Alise and Kate have participated in, have led and have collaborated with students, staff and faculty on several initiatives to enhance accessibility through relational strategies. And I think this is already a very important one. Accessibility through relational strategies. We will talk about this later, I think. Alise has been involved in math disabled student organizing for a decade, creating the Hamilton Math Students Collective, a peer support and advocacy group of and for math students that grew to 200 members, as well as several other cross-disability student groups. As another relational strategy, there was job sharing as a role as accessibility facilitators at McMaster's University that enabled Kate and Alise to design the university's accessible education training, to establish a new employee accessibility network, to cultivate community among disabled employees at the university, and to develop a university-wide accessibility newsletter with annually more than 60 contributors. Alise and Kate have also co-authored with colleagues a book chapter documenting of more than 40 years of intergenerational work to advance accessibility at their university. They have been writing an article on advancing digital accessibility through partnership with disabled students to user test websites, and they co-edited with disabled students 2 digital magazines or zines amplifying student perspectives on madness, mental health, neurodivergence, and accessibility in post-secondary education. I think these are a lot of actions. So I think we are confronted with 2 very active colleagues with a lot of activism also. And I was talking in advance to Alise. Alise wanted to bring Kate. I don't know if I missed something in my introduction, Alise or Kate, something you want to know. Okay. So then it's good to start with the questions we prepare for everybody in every session of this webinar series. And is it okay that, do you want to jump in already from the beginning with your PowerPoint or with your overview? Perhaps
Well,
it's good.
If you want to introduce the questions, then we will jump in with our PowerPoint guided response to them.
Okay, yeah. Okay. We work in this webinar series around that idea of neuroatypicality. That's a mouthful of idea. And what does neuroatypicality mean for higher education is our first question. So we are organizing a kind of a friction, confrontation, clash, whatever, bridge between the idea of neuroatypicality and higher education as a first question. 2, we think about how higher education can be configured differently from the viewpoint of neuroatypicality. What does neuroatypicality do within higher education, and what does it mean to build together a different higher education system? That's the second question. The third question is, what does neuroatypicality has to offer higher education, and not only as a little gift, but as a big thing concerning the politics, the ethics, the ontology, and the epistemology of higher education? That's the third question. What does neuroatypicality has to offer? And the fourth question is, how might neuroatypicality as an alternative intersect with a very important question in different parts of the world? It's the question of decolonization, the idea of post-colonial debates in higher education. That's the fourth question. So we are bringing in those 4 questions. We are offering them to both of you. And I read your work. I saw your work. I almost felt your work. So I think we will get a lot of insights, or we can have a lot of topics we can discuss together. Is this a moment to start your PowerPoint?
Yeah, I'll just start sharing my screen.
And I'll get going as Kate does that. We'd like to start by acknowledging that we are joining you from Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, which is located on the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississauga nations. This seminar series has been really wonderful, bringing together thinkers and theory that open up new spaces and possibilities. Oh, and Kate's going to do that, and my notes are going to disappear. And we're grateful for the invitation to share some of our work and look forward to engaging in conversation with you. For us, the meaning of neuroatypicality starts from our daily life in the form of practical things we can do to make our lives and those of our friends and community members more livable. So this morning, we want to contribute some concrete examples of what it has looked like for us to theorize from practice and practice theory, and possibilities for collaboration across theorists and practitioners and students and staff. So we'll respond to the webinar prompts by sharing some stories and have assembled a few slides so that we can share some visual illustrations of our work. While there are many aspects of our earlier lives that inform today's story, for our purposes, we'll start at the beginning of our most recent degrees a decade ago at McMaster University in Canada. To illustrate our story on the slide, we have an icon of me, Alise, with short hair and glasses, and one of Kate with a high ponytail and glasses. I came to our university to start my PhD in social work in 2012. At the time, I was experiencing some disability phenomena more intensely than I ever had before. I was afraid of thinking and building knowledge because healthcare encounters had made me question and doubt the legitimacy of my thoughts and come to fear what might happen if I let my mind wander and imagine. I was also healing from a number of harmful encounters with healthcare professionals that had disrupted my sense of self-worth and confidence. And I had 3 different experiences of care professionals from services I had used showing up as students in a class I was taking or teaching, or as a professor in my program. So school and disability got all tangled together, and I felt uncomfortable and nervous being surrounded by care professionals in a school of social work. My closest friend and colleague, who I did a lot of community organizing with, had also moved to another province, and so I found myself scared, distrustful, lonely, and alone.
Mm-hmm. And so I started at a different university, actually, than the university where Alise and I met in 2009. And my disability symptoms had really started in 2008 while I was living abroad. And the experience was extremely frightening and very painful. And so, sort of, I won't go into details, but all of the ways that folks could maybe collectively imagine something being painful in your body and your mind. And while I was at another university that's actually located in a different province in Canada, in Quebec, I had a really great example of community care. So the university was quite small where I was. And so didn't have a lot of formalized accessibility support. And actually the legislation in Quebec, we have very rigorous legislation for accessibility in Ontario, but not so much in Quebec. But because the university was small, because it was easy to create networks of friends, it was actually remarkable, the community care that I was able to experience through that university, but had to transfer back to Ontario in 2012 because it looked like I would be living in Quebec, about 10 hours away from my family for 10 years at the rate that I was finishing my university degree. And my health just took another hit, moving back to a university that was very large, very decentralized, had really wonderful formalized support that had been structured and threaded into the university, as Alise will chat a little bit about at the end of our presentation. For over 40, 50 years, our university has been building on accessibility practice and accessibility networks. And so really well-established accommodation processes, but very unreliable because I was falling into a category of disability that didn't have a lot of funding attached to it. Invisible, chronic illness, chronic pain, et cetera, et cetera. There are distributed methods of allocating funding for accommodation support in a lot of Canadian university systems. And oftentimes folks that experience quote unquote fundable disabilities will get funded note taker support or funded care support through the accommodation process. And so I was forced into relying on a network of volunteers, which was not useful and not particularly consistent. And so had to do a lot of work during my first couple of years to figure out just an incredible number of workarounds, trying to figure out my own technological solutions, depending on a couple of friends for technological solutions, but really not able to address the disability symptoms that I was experiencing in any kind of supportive or accessible way. So I had come to sort of, like Alise just described, entangling disability experience with the university experience. this became quite detrimental to my overall academic experience. And I just found myself with these consistent feelings of overwhelmed. Folks might have noted in literature this need for folks with disabilities to be consistently hyper prepared, organized, needing to always force myself to focus. I was at the time not able to take my own notes, so would sit in lectures and have to pay attention to listen to lectures for hours on end in the hopes that I could memorize what it was that the lecturers were saying, and be able to transcribe later what it was that I could remember from lectures, which is not the greatest strategy, but the strategy I was relying on at the time. So this exacerbated disability symptoms by way of heightening already well-established perfectionism. Isolation became a good part of my life, I think as quite a shared disability experience in general for a lot of folks experiencing disability. And just this general feeling of not being able to achieve the things that I really felt that I could have in different circumstances.
So the first kind of relationships I sought to develop on campus were in the form of disabled student peer support. I was lucky to have the opportunity to participate in the MAD Student Society, a MAD student peer support group in Toronto when I was a student there, and so worked to create an equivalent community in my new city of Hamilton, an hour away. Over 2012 to 2016, the group grew to 200 members, all of whom identified in some way with navigating mental health disabilities in education settings. I put a lot of time and energy into creating spaces for myself and other MAD students to form relationships, make friends, care for one another, and facilitate access for each other in ways the institution failed to provide. For example, beyond hosting and moderating meetings, events, and an email listserv, I would ghostwrite members' emails to their professors to seek disability-related accommodations, accompany people to appointments, circulate underground knowledge between members to help each other navigate the institution. In gathering with and desiring each other, we pushed back on ableist and neurotypical ideas that disabled people should find normal, non-disabled friends, that it's risky for us to hang out with each other, or that we don't make good friends or have the social skills to be in relationships or to support each other. On the slide are some of the different ways we collectively tried to challenge neurotypical ways of relating in the university. The School of Social Work is in a building designed in the 1970s, all white cinder blocks. In many ways, it looks and feels like a psychiatric institution. It's cold and sharp and clangy. It has bright fluorescent lights. The hallways are bare, except for photographs of graduated classes. Everyone is typically working alone in their own office. There's a lack of personal disclosure or discussion of just daily life and being human. So we took over a teaching assistant office and hung up magnetic whiteboards so we could write messages to each other and create magnet poetry. We made activist buttons and magnets that tried to reimagine common mental health discourses, suggesting that a diagnosis of mental illness should be an invitation into community rather than a scary statistic. We hung up bed sheets from the ceiling to create a blanket fort for fun and to cover the terrible fluorescent lighting. We left coloring supplies in the hallways and colored in feminist coloring pages and hung them on the wall, posted friendly sticky notes around the halls with positive messages, made a sticker chart where folks could give themselves stickers for whatever they wanted to celebrate, whether that was getting out of bed that day or big things like defending a PhD. We made a complete loop of colorful paper chains that we hung up and down every single hallway until they connected. And with a social work colleague, we organized what we called fun parties and then later floor parties in the School of Social Work, where we invited folks to hang out, craft, eat, and informally chat with each other. In all of these activities, we fostered our own relationships with each other through the different interventions into the space, coming up with and enacting new ideas and working together to hang things up. And the interventions themselves tried to shift the relational possibilities to create opportunity for hallway conversation and connection, to change the tone and feel of the spaces that informed how we were with each other. There was unsurprisingly a mixed response. Some things were allowed to stay and caught on. For example, other departments on other floors in the building created their own coloring baskets. People participated in magnet poetry. Faculty and students continued the floor parties after I had left. For other things, we faced resistance. We were told our blanket fort was a fire hazard and that we had to dismantle it. Our paper chains, which we hung up in December using many different colors, were seen as too festive. And so we were forced to take them down in January. We also sought to challenge some of the common representations of mental illness on campus and the ways of relating they promote. The research study flyers around campus recruiting students experiencing emotional distress into pharmaceutical or clinical studies were getting really annoying. So a member and I created spoofs. On the left is a copy of the original poster, and on the right is the one we created that we posted on top. We even came up with a new university logo that inserted the word MAD into our university name, so we had McMadster instead of McMaster University. Instead of presenting symptoms of worry as too much and evidence of a disorder and eligibility for a research study, we acknowledged worry as a completely reasonable reaction and that folks affected by worry might like to join our peer support group. For example, we added some legit worries to the list, like, do you worry that people will find out about your mental health history? Do you worry about people calling police to take you to hospital? Do you worry about medication side effects? Do you worry about people discriminating against you? In our mind, all entirely legitimate worries. Part of my motivation is that I wanted there to be representations of other possibilities for MAD folks in the hallways that didn't just say we needed mental health services. And then I got in a little bit of trouble. The drug study group complained and I got banned from hanging up more posters until I apologized to a number of different people and promised not to do it again. I was warned that I wasn't allowed to contravene branding guidelines by altering the university logo, and they wouldn't let me hang up more posters until I removed that part. But I did get a really lovely email from a person saying that they had 5 of the worries on the poster and wanted to join the peer support group, and we welcomed them in. This last example I'll share, published in the MAD Student Zine we created, is my response to our university's instructions for faculty on how they should support students in difficulty, by which they mean MAD students. The instructions include a list of various warning signs, such as references to suicide, disruptive behavior, learning problems that a student may exhibit that indicates they are in distress and that a faculty member should intervene by directing them to counseling, calling emergency services, or some other action. So I satirize this by suggesting that instead of signs that a student is in distress, we really need to watch for signs that a faculty member is in distress, expressing ableism or otherwise causing harm to MAD students, for example, through actions that contravene human rights, misuse power, disordered engagement with evidence and knowledge, and accessibility barriers in their teaching. The intervention sought to resist the ways of relating the university endorses: surveillance, potentially non-consensual interventions, referring people to services outside of the classroom. And the hope really is that instructors and staff instead change the ways we view and understand distress so that we lean into and sustain relationships with all students, including those experiencing distress, and create classrooms and curricula that welcome folks in and anticipate their learning needs rather than sending them away. Facilitating peer support groups for disabled students. This one I've described and several other ones affected me in a number of ways. In some ways, the groups helped me feel less alone. I gained new people in my life who validated some of my challenging experiences through their own. The space helped me recover some of the confidence in my knowledge and abilities that I had lost through pathologizing encounters in the healthcare system. In facilitating these spaces, I began to challenge my understanding of and engagement in relationships. For example, my social work training had not taught me what it really means and looks like to care deeply for people, to love them, to attend to people's access needs. Social workers often learn very binary, non-mutual forms of relating where one person is a helper and one is a recipient. And so in these spaces, I explored what it might look and feel like to do relationships differently. I also grew up in spaces that prioritized biological and heterosexual family relationships, care responsibilities to spouses and children, and a kind of self-sacrifice or service to others that can disregard their agency and come at the expense of ourselves. And so through these peer spaces, I began to think more about what other types of kinship and care relationships. But in other ways, disabled student peer support spaces contributed to my loneliness. Most of those in the spaces could not relate to my particular experiences of disability, encounters with the healthcare system, or as a PhD student, or my particular generation of social movement organizing. So for the most part, I didn't talk about these aspects of difference. I just generalized components that seemed others could relate to. A number of folks in the space did the same thing, de-emphasizing, for example, experiences related to racism and focusing on similarity as is known to happen in peer spaces. I also took on a lot of care labor to maintain the space, which became exhausting and also situated me as less of a peer and as less able to seek support through the group. So although I had a lot of fun and have many fond memories, learned a ton, and continue several meaningful friendships with folks I met through the groups also saddened me, made me think more about relationships I longed for and tried to create for others and yet didn't have access to myself, such as with disabled mentors or teachers or colleagues. On this slide are several collages related to my experiences of loneliness that we'll publish next month in a new MAD student zine. They're a bit too complex to describe, but we will have accessible versions and visual descriptions when the zine comes out. As part of my PhD work, I began to theorize about my experiences of loneliness on campus and how loneliness persisted even after creating MAD and disability community. When I talked about my loneliness to neurotypical people, it felt as if they understood this as an individual or psychological problem, that there was something wrong with me, that I was feeling lonely, and that my loneliness was something I would personally have to fix on my own. However, by working with two concepts from feminist philosophy, that of ethical loneliness described by Jill Stauffer and epistemic injustice as elaborated by Miranda Fricker, I instead repositioned loneliness as something created by the university and as a political and ethical issue rather than a psychological one. I argued that the university abandons MAD and disabled students as learners and knowers, for example, through broken and demeaning accommodation processes and assumptions that we are liability risks, that profs and students are incapable of supporting or being in relationship with us, that we should be sent away to counseling services. This was my first thinking about how relationships support us or don't support us, and how incredibly important relationships are to survival and belonging on campus. I also began thinking about loneliness as a MAD way of knowing. Through relationships with Kate, this theorizing got broader.
So Alise and I first found each other and began working together in 2016. And on this slide, we've got our little Alise and Kate icons meeting one another. And I appear to be serving up some kind of opinion to Alise by way of my blasé expiration and hand-on-hip attitude. We started our work together in conditions of challenging relationships in the academy that were disabling us and causing us harm. And so Alise has described exhaustion and loneliness from extensive unpaid equity work, I think over 4,000 hours of unpaid equity work, and non-reciprocal care relationships within peer support spaces. And in my case, the most disabling relationships tended to be ones where someone had substantial power over me, which makes sense because I was in my undergraduate at the time. For example, in a supervisory capacity, and where disruptions to the relationship, either real or imagined, so future imaginings, could have had seriously detrimental impacts on my professional and or academic progression. And so very broadly, some of these relationships looked like exploitation, when folks with more relational power would abuse relationships and use your labor in the name of building a scholarly representation or reputation for themselves. Intellectual theft, claiming ownership of work that I had done, that Alise had done, typically as a student, without providing credit, and then barring access from the intellectual property that we had created. And then abandonment, tasking students. In the case of my case, I was a student staff member for several years, straddling many different worlds. So oftentimes tasking these folks with projects or academic and administrative work that exceeds so far the boundaries of the role or the pay grade, and then just kind of sending them off into the deep end to navigate the work with an incredible amount of responsibility on their own and with really very little accountability. And so, these relationships intersect with one another. They're not always discretely defined as I've just described them. So for example, I often experienced exploitation as a result of abandonment or intellectual theft and can't really easily untangle those situations. But at the time, I didn't actually have language to identify this disablement or these harms. And it's actually just been in putting together these types of conversations with Alise for this particular talk, but also another talk that we did with colleagues from Berlin, that we were beginning to put words to what some of those relationships looked like and how they felt and how we could maybe define them for the purposes of a presentation. And so when thinking about the impact of those particular relationships, I know for myself, it just made me feel like I was consistently responsible for huge projects and pieces that were above my qualification and academic status, where I was not named as the primary investigator, but was being tasked with doing the work that the primary investigator would have been doing. And this made me very angry. That's how I was expressing it at the time. I was really feeling a lot of anger and frustration about what was happening, but not knowing how to fix it. I didn't really know how to navigate the academy as somebody who was in their undergraduate degree. And I'd also had to slow down my degree over a period of 8 years. And so these concepts that I had learned in a degree that I was doing at the time, which was in Indigenous studies, helped me to recognize that my ideas and thoughts did have value, because this is a huge cornerstone of, I would say, Indigenous and decolonization studies, is just this idea that ideas have value and ideas are very easy to be kind of absorbed into somebody else's thinking without crediting them, because it's difficult to credit and to provide copyright on ideas, for example. So I was recognizing that the thoughts had value and that fresh intellect was essentially the currency that was expected to be paid by inexperienced academics and academic staff who were positioned as needing to pay these dues in order to advance in academic settings, whether this was conscious or unconscious for some of the folks that were supervising me at the time. It was definitely happening. And then who are tasked with replicating. So if, for example, you pay your dues, you're then tasked with replicating the intellectual extraction type of relationship. But at the time, I was just really unwell and I did not see myself progressing in my academics past my undergraduate degree. And so I think I was even angrier about this than perhaps others might be. Or more specifically, I expressed this anger often to Alise more willingly. And because of that, this has actually kind of reverberated into the work that I do today, where I just almost ad nauseum credit folks for the work that they do because of what's happened in sort of past disabling relationships. At the same time, these disabling relationships forced me to analyze my own way of relating to others, how I might be or might have been responsible for causing harm, being extractive, being pushy, taking too much, et cetera, and that this is something that I'm still forced to work on and reconcile with every day, especially because of the work that I do and the fact that my work is often in relation with other folks as someone who's overseeing an accessibility program within an equity and inclusion office. So, I was just sort of feeling desperate and unconfident, like there was no horizon at the time. And when Alise and I met and began sharing with each other our difficult experiences in relationships, we gained ideas and encouragement to rethink them. And I think if we hadn't experienced these relational harms, we perhaps wouldn't have found our way into supporting relational access for each other. And I don't think we would have been able to value each other in the ways that we have come to value each other as we have. So as mentioned previously, Alise and I are living in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, which is located on the traditional territories of the Erie, the Neutral, the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississauga nations. And so I'm a non-Indigenous settler who did a degree in Indigenous studies. And I come into conversations like this one, understanding the relationships that my ancestors held with Indigenous people were likely ones that were not entered into honestly, that weren't valued or even acknowledged. And what I understand of my own histories points to one of settler-farmer immigration, likely involving the exchange of large swaths of unceded Indigenous territory in exchange for so-called working and settling, so colonizing the lands into farmlands. And so I don't feel that this is my fault. No one can control how and to whom they were born, and I'm indeed very grateful, albeit sometimes overwhelmed for and by the life that I have. But rather, I do see and take the responsibility in trying to interrogate my own current relationships to and understandings of these lands themselves, their original inhabitants, as well as what I have learned from these lands and its original inhabitants since my time existing in these territories. And I do this in an attempt to stop replicating and what I interpret as being bad and harmful relationships. So why I talk about this, and more specifically in relation to this presentation, is that I wholeheartedly credit and acknowledge my understandings of the types of relationships that Alise and I are discussing today, and even this concept of relational access, as having been fundamentally informed by completing a degree in Indigenous studies. And that what Alise and I are talking about in many ways is not at all new in relation to knowledge or practice. Indeed, many forms of relational access have been practiced on these lands that we're currently inhabiting for millennia. And relationships are fundamentally, they are fundamental to healing in many Indigenous communities. And more to this, are fundamental to Indigenous epistemologies and ontologies. So ways of knowing, being, relating to the land and to each other. And so what we're speaking about with reference to concepts from disability studies and disability justice are forms of relating that counter Western colonial ideas of relationships, where we're separate from each other and independent in competition, in enacting practices of relational access between disabled folks that we'll speak about in just a moment. They also require us to seriously reflect on the importance of relationships and our responsibilities in them, including settler relationships with Indigenous communities within our North American context, and accountability to these relationships and their maintenance and preservation. So in beginning our journey into developing a healthy and positive and access-oriented relationship with one another, Alise and I first began working with each other as student employees at the Teaching and Learning Center at McMaster. And we met in both having applied to be part of a team that was creating our university's training for instructors on how they could enhance accessibility into teaching and learning and build it into their own practice. Through understanding how we each worked best, our first tangible examples of relational access was applying to the job share that Geert mentioned in our introduction back in 2017. At the time, I did not feel qualified to apply to a posted position as an accessibility specialist at McMaster. I was fresh out of my undergrad. I had worked as an assistant in the program, but this particular job felt overwhelming in scope. Alise at the time was looking for more professional, practical experience to complement PhD work and to address gaps in their resume. And so we applied to the job as a job share, even though it was not posted as a job share, and proposed 80% would be me, 20% Alise. Alise would act as a mentor in some areas that intersected with community engagement and academia, and I would facilitate most of the administrative components of the role that are not at all productive for Alise. And so Alise had been co-teaching a social work course at the time, so the idea of job sharing being possible and desiring was in our mind. And what we came to understand working with each other during this particular job share is what I somewhat cheekily refer to as our combination of introversion and extroversion superpowers, which we have come to understand in our case as being getting to know your colleague or partner so well that you know their preferences, you know their areas of strength, so you can both do the things that most are going to benefit you given your skill sets and training. And so as an example of this, Alise prefers to work behind the scenes and to not draw attention to themselves, which is challenging in an academic career where those requirements, there are many requirements around self-promotion. I had learned to do this growing up by being raised by salespeople. And so I, in many ways, act as a bit of a personal coach for many folks in my life, for Alise in particular, and have no problem promoting other people while I'm speaking or when I'm engaging with folks in my regular day-to-day work. But I do struggle because of my disability experience with arranging huge swaths of information to edit down into coherent communication and illustration. And again, so my tendency is to become quickly overwhelmed, and this extends to information overloading. And this is an area where Alise really shines. So, you know, we've now got 3 examples represented on the slide. We've got the creation of the accessible education training that's on the left, the Forward with Flexibility Teaching and Learning resource on accessibility and inclusion. We've got an announcement for our network for employees with disabilities, and also the 2017 Accessibility and Disability Inclusion Update, which was the first attempt to translate what had typically been, I would say, kind of boring compliance-focused reports that would only be read by the president of our university, and translate that and communicate that out to a wider audience of folks at the university who are engaging in many different forms of accessibility and critical disability and MAD studies work, but not at all connected. So Alise came up with the structure, the idea of having this cross-campus communication. We both built networks out to get contributions that first year. I think we got 40 contributions the first year. And then we're now in our 4th iteration. It's 60 to 70 contributions every year, and just really expansive illustrations of what accessibility and critical disability and MAD studies work, research, scholarly practice can look like across an institution. So we collaborated on these projects during our job share in different sorts of way. I mentioned that Alise would come up with many of the ideas and infrastructure, would conceptualize areas that intersected with academia in particular, and would contribute to writing, and then would flesh out the conceptual academic portion. And then for me, I would do the coordination, the administration, the project management, the editing, the public promotion, and the public relationships. And through these projects, we also sought to support relational access for others. So I've already mentioned as part of the network, which was, to bring together folks with disabilities who were staff and faculty within our institution, our real goal was community building with that group. Information sharing was the main goal, but also I would say informational community building via the update so accessibility workers on campus could find each other, which they have. And we've been told many times the update acts as a bit of a navigation guide for new accessibility workers who come into our university. And then also by creating a training that encourages responsibility by all members of the campus for accessibility. So the book on the left in particular has been written within a framework of distributed and collective responsibility. So very briefly, try to do this briefly, given the time, I'm just checking our time. Friendship, mentorship, job sharing, what this relationship has offered to us. Professionally, I think the implications and impacts of this relationship in relation to my current role as an accessibility program manager, it's indescribable. My role is particularly complex. It intersects with legal, educational, scholarly, technical, community engagement, and project management facets. And I really credit my specific relationship with Alise in how I've become so well positioned, confident, and exceedingly competent in many different areas of accessibility and disability work, but most specifically community engagement practices, as well as critical and scholarly work. And this actually ends up lending a weight and legitimacy to what I'm doing that would typically be viewed as purely administrative and be discounted by scholarly community members within our institution. So more personally, I would think developing and building my best thoughts. I really do this when I don't need to worry about writing, about taking notes, ordering thoughts, when I can just speak. And so in a previous life, before I developed disability symptoms, I used to be a prolific writer. I was writing short books by the time I was in my teen years. And my disability flare-ups, especially in the first 5 years, made this impossible. I actually didn't write at all for probably 5 or 6 years, and might have been able to type was probably the closest I could get, but no handwriting. And so this really, for me personally, would impact my confidence and result in unprocessed emotion, in particular frustration. And as folks could probably imagine, was particularly disabling in a higher education setting. So, I had been figuring out all of these just-in-time work solutions via technology. I had scribes, I had some note takers that were inconsistent for several years before Alise. And because of that experience, I had began to associate writing with pain and thinking with pain, especially higher level critical approaches to thinking were really entangled with pain experiences. And so, through these experiences, I began to tell myself that I would never be able to progress in higher ed past my very prolonged undergraduate degree, because the complex thinking and writing was just too much. And so with Alise, I have someone far more academically learned than I, who simply allows me to sit and talk and talk and talk in the development of our work. They capture all of my thoughts. We discuss them. We build on them. Alise orders them oftentimes. We go back, we revise, we read more, and we think more. Essentially the tenets of academic thought and inquiry. But in my case, this has largely been expressed orally, which, is a traditional foundational to many different cultural ways of knowing and expressing and being, but completely outside of and largely unrecognized by traditional Western academic practice. So from this relational access facilitated by and through Alise, my academic confidence has really developed and begun to take shape. I would never say that I am a scholar for obvious reasons, including a lack of degrees, but I do assert that through this process of relational access, I have come to think, inquire, and forefront curiosity like a scholar. And for this, I'm just really grateful and actually have been able to see myself re-entering higher education in the next couple of years. And I might turn this over to Alise at this point.
So for me professionally, at the time I was facing barriers related to traveling, which was pretty essential pre-pandemic to my developing career. And so asked Kate to travel with me to academic conferences, which opened up opportunities for us to collaborate on work that we could present together. I've asked her to join this talk too, to help make it more fun. Personally, coming to feel a sense of respect and reciprocity in our relationship made me more aware of the relationships in my life that were not respectful or reciprocal, even though I might have believed them to be, and helps me be more intentional in setting boundaries and entering relationships voluntarily. Kate has many more words for and ways of understanding emotions than I do, so I would talk to her about being exhausted or frustrated, and she would reflect back to me helpful interpretations of what was going on. As much as I can politicize disability experiences generally or intellectually, this is much harder to do in a personal life. So having a friend who can reframe situations has been really affirming. Perhaps most significantly, developing a trusting relationship with Kate, who has found my ideas and knowledge valuable, has helped me begin to trust my own ways of knowing and thinking that healthcare encounters had caused me to doubt. So this different experience of being in a relationship with Kate began to inform some of the theorizing I was doing in my doctoral dissertation. I found my way to ideas of emotional and ontological harms from repression, which are taken up in disability studies through the concept of psycho-emotional disableism, and in post-colonial feminist and other studies as psychic alienation, psychological or internalized oppression. Disability oppression can have effects on our confidence, our sense of worth as living creatures, our trust in ourselves or others, our sense of security, in our ways of being. In other words, disability oppression doesn't just affect what we can do, such as whether we can physically access a space. It also affects who we are, what we believe we are capable of, our dreams and expectations, and who we can be. The disability justice movement developing out of the community's care and knowledge of disabled, queer, racialized, and Indigenous people has shared a lot of writing in this area. For example, Mia Mingus writes the following about the emotional effects of ableism and inaccessibility. Mingus says, the weight of inaccessibility is not just logistical. It is not just about ramps, ASL interpreters, straws, and elevators. It is just as much feeling and trauma as it is material and concrete. It is made up of isolation, the fear of being left by the people you love, the pain of staring or passing, the sting of disappointment, the exhaustion of having the same conversations over and over again. It is an echoing loneliness, part shame, part guilt, part constant apology, and thank you. Through our relationship with each other, Kate and I have been able to explore these kinds of harms from ableism and neurotypicality on our spirit, our ways of being and emotions, but also how healing, accessible relationships can address these harms. A number of different concepts have been proposed to describe the kinds of relationships and ways of relating that can address emotional harms from disability oppression. For example, access intimacy, initially elaborated by Mia Mingus, refers to the feeling when someone gets your access needs and when you don't need to engage in emotional or cognitive labor to get your needs met. While access intimacy can often be understood in terms of having one's physical and sensory access needs met, Kate and I have figured out ways of offering each other a kind of ontological and epistemological and emotional access. For example, before I met Kate, I had largely been thinking alone, communing with books and articles, but not having direct colleagues with whom to collaborate, largely because I was exploring mad studies from within a social work program and university where there was limited scholarship of this kind going on at the time. This, combined with a dose of epistemic doubt from my interactions with healthcare systems, put a cap on how far my thinking and mad practices could go. I was in many ways scared of being and knowing and thinking in mad ways and had few checks for confirming the value of these practices or noticing and pulling me in if I was getting lost. When Kate began offering this kind of check and company and reassurance, I gained trust and confidence and motivation to continue exploring mad ways of knowing, being, and relating. The idea of people as affordances is also being developed by Arsely Dokumatiu in conversation with access intimacy. So that's a concept that refers to how people can become affordances for one another by making up access and making up for inhospitable environments and the affordances such spaces fail to provide. And microprotections is another concept developed by Acton and colleagues, where the authors propose microprotections as strategies to counteract microaggressions and to co-create alternative ways of relating, participating, and collaborating. For Kate and I, through our relationships with each other in disability communities, we've had some of our access needs understood and anticipated, have made up for the inaccessibility of each other's environments, and through these relations have been able to counteract various harms. Most significantly, in our case, our relationship has enabled us to generate and share new knowledge that we wouldn't have otherwise been able to do alone, knowledge that would have otherwise been lost or simply never generated. I think you're muted, Kate.
Thanks, Alise. I'll try to go through this a little bit quickly because we have a few more slides and want to get into conversation with folks. We alluded to this a little bit in addition to peer support, friendship, mentorship, and job sharing relationships, Alise and I really sought to create disability scholarly community to support us and others in gaining confidence in our intellectual abilities as scholars, feeling motivated in scholarly work, exchanging ideas and lived experiences that extend and deepen our knowledge, and reducing our isolation as educators and researchers. So some examples listed on the slide. Existing training opportunities for teaching assistants focused on their role in the student accommodation process rather than how TAs themselves might be disabled people and teaching with disabilities. So we created a session on teaching, and later it became teaching and learning with a disability for McMaster's annual TA Education Day. This has been, as I mentioned, facilitated in subsequent years. Alise led the creation of a disability and MAD studies reading group as a form of intellectual peer support with fewer care labor responsibilities, this space to talk and share ideas and read and discuss articles together. And as I've mentioned, I was feeling that I couldn't pursue or complete grad studies at this time as a disabled student. And so with colleagues, we created workshops and panels and discussions on thinking about graduate studies with disabled students. We ran these for a couple of years. This is the 2019 poster. 2020, I think we all know what happened. The event series was actually scheduled the week that we went into lockdown, so that didn't happen. But this past year, through online forums, we have been able to start a new initiative, or we created a new initiative with student, staff, and faculty scholars to meet each other and to share their disability-related research with one another. These were presented as lightning talks, and this happened for our December 3rd International Day of Persons with Disabilities celebration. And I think we had 20 to 30 talks that took place during that day or two, and it was really successful. So we just keep finding new spaces to work with each other within the auspices of our different employee roles and where we're able to be flexible and working together. But, you know, we've been transitioning out of peer and student roles and into staff and instructor roles in the last few years. And so we've been thinking about how we can support access still for each other as we engage in new and different relationships with students in particular and staff. And so we've also recognized how the kind of relational access that we gain through each other is not very scalable or easily replicable as a strategy. It's taken a lot of work. It's been aided by the stability of our presence in the same university and city and the flexibility and autonomy of our job positions, which grants us these opportunities to collaborate with each other. So we've also been looking for other ways of facilitating relationships that support access where more people benefit, particularly recognizing that many neurodivergent, disabled, and MAD folks face barriers to accessing relationships in general, much less ones that meet their access needs. And so in addition to some research funding, we've been able to tap into money from our university's Teaching and Learning Center, pairing students and faculty to work on projects to improve education, and our university's career and employment program for students from equity deserving groups. This funding has enabled us to work together to create paid positions for over 30 disabled students in the last several years to collaborate as full partners on projects from design to implementation and publication. So some examples, we've worked with disabled students to test the usability of university websites when using assistive technology, with Leva Carrot from Ghent University and 5 disabled students, creating 2 zines where neurodivergent and disabled students have space to share perspectives on navigating universities with disabilities, access barriers, and recommendations for how educators can enhance accessibility in teaching and learning. And the cover images for these zines are on the slide now. And then also co-supervising a social work placement student. So the possibilities of partnership. We are excited about the possibilities of creating meaningful new opportunities for disabled students to lead and contribute to accessibility work. Through this, beginning to shift the trend of non-disabled people getting the employment opportunities to do accessibility work to more and more disabled folks leading this work, and more of this work being paid than it used to be. These relationships aren't designed to meet our access needs. We needed to recognize and accept this, staying attentive to the power imbalance in our relationships with students, particularly when we became their employer. But a partnership way of working reciprocates in other ways. It has restored a sense of energy, fun, motivation when working with students. We learn from them about current barriers in the institution and new ideas for addressing them, and offers us disabled colleagues when we are otherwise working in often non-disabled workspaces. And also the mentoring opportunities can be really fulfilling. So in trying to make these sustainable, while working in partnership with students has enabled us to modestly scale up relational kinds of access to support several students, we've also realized that there's a real limit on how many meaningful, accessible relationships we can support at a time. These take time, they take care to support access for disabled students. The relationships may use more energy than they restore. So we've had to be very thoughtful and carrying out at times in smaller doses for energy reasons, and we're still figuring this out. Alise and I aren't running many of our projects together anymore, and our roles have us doing very different things, but there's been significant value in us having a partnership with each other while collaborating with students. And we have each been the primary staff on varied partnership projects, while the other takes up a backup supporting role or as a consultant. So for example, I coordinated the implementation of the user testing project. Alise was involved in helping the team pursue an academic publication. Alise supports the zine teams more fulsomely, and I joined particular meetings to support with outreach and ensuring that the zines were actually designed accessibly. And this type of working has helped me and helped us think about partnerships being more sustainable for us in particular. Having colleagues with whom we can process the team dynamics and reflect on our role, negotiation in partnership as staff members can step in and offer their expertise and cover facilitation if needed. And it's also enabled us to maintain connections to projects that offer great learning and growth opportunities, but where we don't actually have the time to be fully involved. So we create a better experience, I think, for learners together than when we're trying to go at this alone.
So we'll end with this slide. We've talked about how neurodivergent and disabled ways of relating through peer support, friendship, mentorship, partnership can contribute to different configuration of higher education. Our final example is how neurodivergence and disability can offer alternatives in regards to intergenerational relationships. When Kate and I were creating our university's accessible education training, we wanted to incorporate a chapter on disability history, including our university's own disability history, but we didn't actually know what it was that predated our involvement in it. So we had the opportunity to work with student partner Michelle Sales to develop some of that history into an illustrated story. And since then have also worked with another student partner, Muna Wolf, and 6 other campus colleagues to prepare a book chapter that documents our interconnected stories of engaging in accessibility work over the past 40 years. Since then, I've been continuing the project to find further traces of disability history. Most significantly, I've learned about several disabled student groups that have gathered on campus since at least the 1974 creation of the Handicapped Students Union. We hope this work has many impacts beyond us, but there's a couple I want to reflect on in terms of how they've supported access for me. I've gained a kind of retrospective access through relationships with the past, finding the names of over 30 disabled student advocates at our university who predate my time on campus and being able to talk with some of them has helped relieve some of my sense of loneliness and felt burden of coordinating initiatives. I imagine that some of these students face similar emotions that I have had and felt lonely with, feeling alone in advocate roles, grief over losing disabled student community upon graduation, of no longer being a peer within peer spaces I helped create, sadness over creating things for others to access that I will likely never experience for myself, feeling exploited by the institution for hours of unpaid work, or guilty for withdrawing from particular kinds of organizing that became too exhausting and that I could no longer financially afford. And so in my imaginings of these other students, I feel seen and a bit less alone. There's a real risk on campus for us to erase history and gain individual credit for initiatives or ideas, such as positioning work as the first of its kind without due diligence to learn and credit what's been done before. This is particularly the case for student initiatives, given the quick turnover of student cohorts every couple of years and the resulting loss of history. For example, there was a perception and sense on campus that the mass student organizing I was coordinating was new for the university, which I've learned not to be true. There were student mental health peer support groups in the 1990s, and a student was publishing critiques of psychiatry on campus then too. So while the reclamation of madness language or development of neurodiversity studies may be more recent shifts on campus, these are contemporary expressions of a much longer history of work. Feeling gratitude for these earlier activists and humility regarding my own efforts in the face of decades of disability and accessibility work has been helpful, offering different feeling states than anger at the institution, sadness, exhaustion, and helping me tap into some forms of self-compassion. It's also very motivating to learn more about this prior work and to make it more visible to the campus community. In some ways, knowing this history helps me set boundaries around unpaid or involuntary work and prioritize my elective efforts, because disabled people have been actively resisting ableism at our university since at least the 1960s, editorial one wrote into our student newspaper, and will likely be doing so for the next 60 years too, although hopefully not. None of us is individually responsible for changing the institution, nor can we change the institution by ourselves, but we can play a role in this collective work. So I've been able to hook my small efforts into a much longer trajectory of work that existed before me and will continue after I leave. There's a kind of interdependence with the past and the future that becomes possible when we know our history, and a de-individualizing of our work in the present. In our collective work to document the histories we've uncovered and histories of our own work, we hope these stories further bolster generations to come. And so we'll end our stories there and are keen to engage in some conversation with all of you.
Geert, any words from you before we officially transition to the Q&A?
Yeah. Thank you, Alise. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Alise. It's the superpowers together. In this session, you were announcing the way you work together as the nice combination between introversion and extroversion superpowers. So I really like the way you made possible to give us a lot of information, because you started, I think, Alise, by saying we will give you. I wrote it down here. We will give you some practical things, and I think we were like overwhelmed with changing the name of the university as a nice extreme example at one hand to very, very warm exercises and very, very creative ways of bringing people together. Even in your last example, bringing people who are no longer there together with the history of the people who are at the university now. So I'm a little bit overwhelmed by all these nice examples and nice ideas. And I have one question to start with, and then we can go to the question from Stella, I think, who is already asking a question in the chat box. I was so happy to, because when I was reading the Disability and Society article, I saw that you were giving a lot of examples of what we can call microaggression. And now you were looking for resisting and reorganizing and fighting these things. And I was writing down this morning when I took my notes a word of Catherine Runswick-Cole and her colleagues, who are called the Mad Mothers, mothers of children with disabilities who are doing things that are very creative. And they were looking the whole time for what they called micro-kindness moments. Because they say if you talk to a mother of a child with a disability, within 5 minutes, he or she or the family will give you examples of the one person who understood a little bit or started to understand a little bit the things they wanted to share, without putting them away in a category, without putting them away, not listening to their wisdom and not listening to their knowledge. So I'm so happy to find that little bit of micro kindness idea also in the ways you were listing the examples of resistance you were working along. Is this too kind, that word micro kindness, from your point of view?
No, I think that resonates. I'm curious what Kate thinks. I think there is a need for more kindness in the world, and being in these spaces has been an exploration for me, at least, in figuring out what that could look like. How are people kind to me, and how can I be kind to them in the context of our relationships with each other?
Okay. Yeah, I love it. It reminds me of the micro productions example that Alise shared earlier, but also, and I mean, I sit in an administrative space, so I don't sit often in scholarly spaces, but it always strikes me when engaging in scholarly conversation, how sometimes folks are uncomfortable with notions of kindness and love as it relates to scholarship or generating knowledge, when really, I mean, why not? That's sort of meeting folks where it's humanizing them, right? Like, so I feel like when Alise and I are talking about microaggressions as opposed to micro kindness, I think maybe the undercurrent of our presentation throughout is just this notion of care and just relating to one another as our most human selves when we're with one another, and that's maybe something that is not encouraged strongly within academic institutions, and that it's actually taken us years to get to the point where we're finally putting words to what it is that we've been doing for 5 years, seeing each other as humans. Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you for that reflection, because I really felt that there is a kind of bridge between the Matt Mothers group and the groups you are working with. And I met Catherine last week, and we had a nice discussion with Belgian Matt Mothers and herself as a UK Matt Mother, having a lot of connections with Canadian Matt Mothers. So that was a nice coming together. I think perhaps that's the moment to go to Stella's question, who's still with us. And Stella, do you want to ask your question yourself, or do we bring it?
I gave everyone the option of coming in on video and audio, and several people declined. So, oh, here comes Stella now. Great, so Stella can voice it. And then Stella and Liva, I can also give you the chance if you want to have video as well, maybe the option of a co-host so that you can come in with video if you'd like. But you can definitely unmute Stella, I believe, and go ahead and share.
I think Stella can't join, but is listening.
But is listening. Okay. I will read the question from the Q&A. First, she thanks you for the inspiring talk. And the question is, do you have an idea of what might be percentages of non-neurotypicality in academia? Given the type of activity, they might be even higher than in general populations, many possibly undiagnosed. Question mark, big question mark.
May I have that question copy and pasted into the chat just so I can actually read it? I just need to process the information, if that's okay.
Yeah, I can copy and paste it for you there, so it'll be at the very bottom of the chat box.
Thank you, Candace.
Yeah, let me do that for you right now.
That's wonderful. I really appreciate it.
It's an interesting question, and I certainly don't have a statistical answer to it. I think some of what Kate and I have been chatting about recently is like who feels able to identify as neuroatypical, and that is a particular group of people, often white students, that feel like it's safe enough and vague enough and broad enough as a term, and that actually claiming it can be a kind of commodity to negotiate the university. Certainly doing mad activism in the university as a white PhD student is a kind of commodity and way of gaining social capital. So madness experiences in healthcare systems can be awful, but engaging in that kind of scholarship work in the university, like we're in a moment of time where that can open different things for different people depending on who you are. So that the question of how many people would identify is interesting, because it raises a broader question of who gains access to either formal medical systems where they get those kinds of labels, or who seeks them out, who can pay for them, and who is in a position to be able to claim that, or claim affinity, or join and gather in spaces under that kind of an umbrella. I don't know, Kate, if you have other things you wanted to add to that.
No, Alise and I debated putting this type of content in our presentation, but felt that it didn't actually attach into our own personal relationship narrative as well as it could have. And so, Stella, I'll just echo Alise that the actual numbers are difficult to track down, because as more and more opportunities begin to exist in North American opportunities that are in universities rather, that would bootstrap equity deserving folks into programs or access to resources. For example, at McMaster, we have an entire equity, diversity, and inclusion strategy, which has just infused funding dollars into many different facets of the university. So as that's happening, more and more folks are feeling comfortable and confident because it's becoming safer to identify as an equity deserving person, but specifically within the relationship of access to resources, as Alise had mentioned, there are very specific groups of folks that are beginning to sort of claim atypical or neurodiverse identities because it is blanketed, because it is more vague. But also because it is a bit of a straight shoot. So we work primarily, the students that Alise and I work with are racialized disabled students. And I've noticed in the language that racialized students are using when talking about disability experience, it's much less politicized in many ways. Folks who might still describe being a person with a disability, being a person with an impairment, being a person with challenges or trauma or with mental health, someone might say kind of vaguely, but not as readily claiming disability identity. And so I think that'll take a little bit more exploration on my part to tease apart how to get more racialized and Indigenous students into spaces where they feel comfortable claiming the resources that become attached to the identity of neurodiversity or neuroatypicality. But for now, yeah, there's just, it's a bit of a difficult terrain to navigate as an administrator because you also don't want to tell folks that they're not experiencing disability, because that's not what it is. That's not what's happening. It's more just once again a replication of an uneven distribution of resources as it relates to somebody's visible or invisible identities. Yeah, great question though.
Thank you, Stella. Thank you, Kate and Alise, for your answer on that difficult question. And I think the old term from sociology, dark number, is here at this place. These are dark numbers of groups of people who don't want to go into detail about that dark relationships they have. So I think there needs to be a lot of safe places. They need a lot of safe relationships to give us insight or to allow us to get into this very intimate parts of their life. So thank you for that. Are there other people who have questions at the moment in the chat or from the panelists, the co-panelists?
I see Nikki. And I see Nikki's hand.
Yeah, well, firstly, thank you very much for your presentation. And I also feel a little bit overwhelmed by it because it was so thick and very, thank you for it, but I feel like I can't really respond that immediately to it. But I do have some questions. And the one relates to, Alise, you were talking about discovering that there a kind of genealogy of people involved in disabilities from MAD studies that you hadn't known about at your institution, unless I misunderstood you. And whether whether you're growing an archive of that, firstly. And secondly, trying to figure out why those initiatives kind of became invisibilized, or did they fall away? Did they collapse? If so, why? How is it being done differently now? Because I do feel, and maybe it's, following Bren's presentation last month about hope, that there does feel like there's groundswell, and that hopefully these initiatives and others aren't going to disappear. That was the one question. If you want to, or I don't know whether I must give the other questions now or not. Would you like to do one at a time?
Sure. Well, why don't we do one at a time? So yes, okay. Definitely collecting an archive. Have spent hours in our library archive, in our city archive, scrolling around the internet, reading books, to find examples, and then to contact folks that are still living to see if I can get in touch with them and to hear more about their experiences. So we've been engaging in some work to write some of that up, much more to do and process and like even understand what meaning to make of that for me. Why did they collapse? lots of interesting reasons. Like what I've learned about the 1974 one is that it was hard for people to get in contact with each other because they needed to like exchange phone numbers. And it's a very different context of trying to get a hold of each other by phone or by like writing your phone number on a list of piece of paper than the kinds of connectivity that we have now. How does the knowledge disappear? I think in part because of kind of student turnover, but also because staff and faculty who could be anchors into, you know, helping transition knowledge around are often unaware of what's going on. So it's the faculty who are reflecting back to students that what they are doing is new, when it is not, because that knowledge isn't being valued as a kind of knowledge, or we see these kinds of groups as distinct, like we see, you know, the use of mad language as distinct, as opposed to, you know, a new possibility. So like in talking to students, learning disabilities weren't a thing at the time that they were in school, so they didn't even identify as disabled at the time that they were in school. They identify that way now that I've reached out to invite folks who've been disabled at our university over time to get in touch. So like similarly, the language of madness, the language of neurodivergence, those are new words. Students were not, you know, using those in the same way before, but those are the same kinds of conversations. There's just different possibilities that happen at different moments in time. So I think it's also our orientation to time, whether or not we value time. The university is so focused on innovation. There's a lot of pressure on students to demonstrate that they're innovating or developing new things. So there's like lots of pressures towards losing history and the value actually to individuals of losing history, and of seeing types of work as distinct as opposed to how they hang together and how they're actually part of a broader conversation, or the value of understanding them that way. So certainly I'm in the midst of just trying to figure out what that means, what that work has meant to me personally, what the value of that might be to others, how to transfer what I've learned, so when I leave the university, that knowledge doesn't leave with me.
Thank you. We are so happy that you were diving into the archives. This is not the most sexy work to start with, being on your own in an archive, but I hope you could find some jewels that can help us to understand what our former colleagues and students were doing, to learn from them. I think it's a very important element. Nikki, you had another question?
Well, there are two others and they might be linked. The one is, well, I think it's interesting that the idea of connectivity and networking and form and structure, I guess. And that, so for example, the kinds of media that you're using, zines, etc., open up, in a way, I feel that they're quite a radical way of reaching beyond the academy, and I think there is a particular literacy that comes with that, which could appeal to perhaps to a wider group. So that was just an observation, but when I was looking at some of the examples you shared, I was quite curious about the wall, the green wall is it at McMaster, the art wall? And if you could just talk a little bit more about how that works, because I'm looking at the image, it looks like it's a digital image, but am I right in understanding that there really is a physical space that people can go and paste things on campus?
This was the green wall in the digital scene.
Yeah.
So I think you're referring to some of the student groups I was organizing were kind of independent grassroots outside of the institution, and with colleagues worked to make that part of the student union. And so the green wall is in the physical space of our disabled student group in the university. And I don't know that they have art always posted in that wall. Certainly during the pandemic, they have not been. So I think that image is like a photograph of the space that they're typically in, and students digitally creating commentary that they applied on top of the photograph. But certainly that space is a pre-pandemic and will be a pretty hopping space in terms of students designing it the way that they designed it, the kind of lighting that they use in that space, the kind of furniture they have. Like, it really is designed to be a comfy home kind of environment that doesn't exist elsewhere on the campus.
That's what I was confused about, because I was trying to imagine how students would go and be posting on a wall, which is a public space on a campus, and would that feel safe? But the way you've explained it makes complete sense now. Can I ask my third question?
Yeah, and then
that is just
Viv had another question. I think.
Okay, then I'll come back.
Yeah, thank you. I am cognizant that we only have 3 minutes left, but I found your talk, both of yours, very inspirational, and in fact I was quite jealous of what you're doing in your context, because I was also in teaching and learning at my own university, and I have a social work background. So I was really intrigued that, these things were also coming together. But just a quick question, because somebody that I know has found the series very troubling, and they have had issues with madness, and they don't like calling it madness at all. And they were sort of quite angry with me, actually, for bringing these things into the public. And what they said is that it's something very private and very special to them, and bringing it into academia, which is such a hostile place in the first place. So I was just wondering, if other people had responded in such a way, and what your response to that would be.
I could jump in. I don't know, Kate, if you have further. So one piece of that is, like, can we bring this into the university? And I think no, like, there are lots of mad practices that don't fit into the university, or they put us at risk when we engage in them in the university. That there are activities in the university to shut down things that mad, disabled, neurodivergent students have been doing. That there are many more possibilities in the organizing work I was doing when I was unpaid, not affiliated with the university as a student, that I cannot do in the current context of how I am situated in the university. So I think affirming that is definitely a thing, that there's lots of limits and constraints on what madness and neuroatypicality can do in the university, or the harm that can be caused of people who try to do things in the university, drawing on those experiences. And then certainly madness and neuroatypicality are very personal experiences for folks. Certainly that has been a barrier to folks joining the group, has been the name of the group, has been the kind of playfulness with which we are engaging in conversations of madness that is not an accessible or comfortable space for everyone to be in. I think what's made it somewhat possible for how we have done it is that we've come into that together. So we have developed relationships and trust with each other. We have come into learning from each other's experiences. So there's a kind of possibility of playfulness in that space with each other that we, are familiar with, that I don't know would be possible for any of the individual members in a different kind of context outside of those relationships. Yeah, so I mean, to what Kate had mentioned, a lot of what we have done is not easily replicable. It's not a model that can just be inserted into another space. Even trying to build that group in Hamilton, as opposed to where I had learned about it in Toronto, is a very different community, very different student population, very different institution that significantly shaped, what was possible and how we went about doing it. So certainly, I can understand the comments that you're receiving, and individual kind of encounters and ways of engaging in conversations are quite radically different depending on how we're situated and the kinds of relationships that we're in.
Thanks so much for that. And I think the friendship is such an attractive concept for me, you know, and how that's worked for the two of you, and probably, you know, could include more than two.
Yeah, I know that we're a little bit over time, but I'm just sort of reflecting on similar conversations have been happening around our space around the concept of disability justice. So disability justice is a framework that's largely, I mean, entirely started and centers the experiences of Black, Indigenous persons of colors and persons who belong to queer communities, but specifically also with intersections of poverty, low income, and class. And so that framework in particular, I can see it already. Folks are trying to bring it into the university, and it can't survive within a university context as long as universities don't even recognize that class and poverty are even experiences that humans experience, right? So I fully recognize, and I think Alise and I are both very careful around kind of co-opting frameworks into university spaces that then become academicized and completely abstracted from the experiences of the folks who began the political movements themselves. But with saying that, disabled people exist in the university. Like, this is the thing, is that, and they're automatically put into positions of having to politicize their identities in many cases, because they have to fight just for their basic needs to be met within university spaces still. And so I'm hoping that what we've been able to position more so than co-opting a framework of mad ethics or mad practice into the university is one of relational strategy, because it's fundamental and foundational, I think, to the survival of, and I mean, I say survival with a caveat. For me, it certainly felt like survival. It felt like if I had to drop out of university, I would have no benefits, no job prospects, I would have no money, no safety nets. Like, really felt like survival at the beginning of my academic career. Doesn't feel like that as much anymore. But certainly in terms of flourishing, being able to reach your potential, being able to move through spaces where I think folks are consistently underemployed and undereducated, or they're overeducated and underemployed because now they're facing barriers in the workplace in terms of being able to get meaningful work opportunities. I think that's what we've been trying to impress, is that while it might not look like what Alise and I have done, it is highly effective when folks can find each other. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm going to have to bring it to an end now because we're running a little over time. But thanks so much to both of you. It was really wonderful, and I can't wait to actually look at it again, because like Nikki, you really went through so much that it will be really nice to revisit this and to have it as a resource for people. So thank you. And I think Nikki will be talking about our next and final webinar.
Yes, and also thanks to the attendees for attending today. And just following from what Candace said earlier, this will be recorded. It will be available on our YouTube site. So next month is our final webinar, and it's going to be atypically, it's going to be on a Monday the 18th of July at the same time as it will be on the webinar website, the times, etc. Viv will be talking with Tita Makubudia, a writer and poet. If there will be suggested readings that will be available or recommended as well. And if you do have any queries, you can contact me, Nikki Romano, or just consult the website. So until then, we'll see you all on the Monday, the 18th of July. Thanks all.
Thank you, Alise. Thank you, Kate. Bye-bye.
Bye.